The UN Security Council held an emergency meeting on the alleged chemical attack in Syria. The meeting comes as the U.S. State Department announced it has proof the Syrian government is responsible for Saturday's attack. In this portion, we hear from U.S. Ambassador Nikki Haley and the Russian and Syrian ambassadors to the UN.
Mr. President, Excellencies, the situation in the Middle East is in chaos. To such an extent, it has become a threat to international peace and security. The region is facing a true Gordian knot. Different fault lines crossing each other and creating a highly volatile situation with risks of escalation, fragmentation, and division as far as the eye can see, with profound regional and global ramifications. We see a multiplicity of divides. The first is the memory of the Cold War. But to be precise, it is more than a simple memory. The Cold War is back, with a vengeance, but with a difference. The mechanisms and the safeguards to manage the risks of escalation that existed in the past no longer seem to be present. Second, the Palestinian-Israeli divide. Third, the Sunni-Shia divide, evident from the Gulf to the Mediterranean. But it is important to note that apparent religious divides are normally the result of political or geostrategic manipulations. Finally, a wide range of different factors, from opposing attitudes in relation to the role of the Muslim Brotherhood or the status of the Kurds, to the dramatic threats to communities that have been living in the region for millennia and are part of the rich diversity of Middle Eastern societies. This multiplicity of divides is reflected in a multiplicity of conflicts with different degrees of interconnection, several of them clearly linked to the threat of global terrorism. Many forms of escalation are possible. We see the wounds of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict deepening once again. The recent violence in Gaza has resulted in many needless deaths and injuries. I repeat my call for an independent and transparent investigation into these incidents. And I also appeal to those concerned to refrain from any act that could lead to further casualties, and in particular, any measures that could place civilians in harm's way. This tragedy underlines the urgency of revitalization of the peace process for a two-state solution that will allow Palestinians and Israelis to live in two democratic states side by side, in peace and within secure and recognized borders. And I reaffirm the United Nations' readiness to support these efforts. In Yemen, we are witnessing the worst humanitarian disaster in today's world. There is only one pathway to ending the Yemeni conflict and addressing the humanitarian crisis: a negotiated political settlement through inclusive intra-Yemeni dialogue. My special envoy, Martin Griffiths, is doing everything possible to facilitate that political settlement, and he will brief the Council next week. In Libya, I encourage all parties to continue to work with my special representative, Ghassan Salame, as he engages in the political process with a broad range of Libyan interlocutors across the country to implement the UN Action Plan. It is high time to end the Libyan conflict. Iraq demonstrates that progress is possible with concerted local, regional, and global commitment. With the defeat of Daesh, and after overcoming the risk of fragmentation, the government of Iraq must now focus on reconstruction, reforms, and reconciliation. And I hope the upcoming elections will consolidate this progress. At the recent Paris and Rome conferences, the international community reaffirmed its support for Lebanon's sovereignty, stability, and state security institutions. It is absolutely essential to avoid a new Israel-Hezbollah conflict that could inevitably result in many more victims and much greater destruction than the last war. I reiterate the critical importance to act on key principles and commitments on Lebanon, including Security Council resolutions such as 1701 and the policy of disassociation. The dangers of the links to the Syrian conflict are evident in the recent confrontations between Iran and Israel in Syria. Mr. President, Syria indeed today represents the most serious threat to international peace and security. In Syria, we see confrontations and proxy wars involving several national armies, a number of armed opposition groups, many national and international militia, foreign fighters from everywhere in the world, and various terrorist organizations. From the beginning, we have witnessed systematic violations of international humanitarian law, international human rights law, and international law tout court, in utter disregard of the letter and the spirit of the United Nations Charter. For 8 long years, the people of Syria have endured suffering upon suffering. I reiterate, there is no military solution to the conflict. The solution must be political through the Geneva intra-Syrian talks, as stipulated in Resolution 2254 of the Security Council, and in line with the consistent efforts of my Special Envoy, Staffan de Mistura. Syrians have lived through a litany of horrors, atrocity crimes, sieges, starvation, indiscriminate attacks against civilians and civilian infrastructure, the use of chemical weapons, forced displacement, sexual violence, torture, detention, and enforced disappearances. The list goes on. In a moment of hope, the Security Council adopted Resolution 2401, demanding that all parties cease hostilities without delay for a durable humanitarian pause. Unfortunately, no such cessation of hostilities ever really took place. That is the bleak panorama of Syria today. In this panorama, I'm outraged by the continuing reports of the use of chemical weapons in Syria. I reiterate my strong condemnation of the use of chemical weapons by any party to the conflict and under any circumstances. Their use is abhorrent and a clear violation of international law. The seriousness of the recent allegations requires a thorough investigation using impartial, independent, and professional expertise. In this regard, I reaffirm my full support for the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, the OPCW, and its fact-finding mission in undertaking the required investigation into these allegations. The fact-finding mission should be granted full access without any restrictions or impediments to perform its activities, and I take note that the Syrian government has requested it and committed to facilitate it. The first team of the OPCW is already in Syria. A second is expected today or tomorrow. But we need to go further. In a letter to the Council 2 days ago, I expressed, and I quote, my deep disappointment that the Security Council was unable to agree upon a dedicated mechanism to attribute responsibility for the use of chemical weapons in Syria, end of quote, following the end of the mandate of the Joint Investigative Mechanism, or JIM. I want to repeat today that the norms against chemical weapons must be upheld. And as I wrote in the same letter, and I quote, ensuring accountability for a confirmed use of chemical weapons is our responsibility, not least to the victims of such attacks. A lack of accountability emboldens those who would use such weapons by providing them with the reassurance of impunity. This in turn further weakens the norm proscribing the use of chemical weapons and the international disarmament and non-proliferation architecture as a whole. I urge all members to act responsibly in these dangerous circumstances. And I appeal to the Security Council to fulfill its duties and not give up on efforts to agree upon a dedicated, impartial, objective, and independent mechanism for attributing responsibility with regard to the use of chemical weapons. I stand ready to support such efforts. End of quote. Increasing tensions and the inability to reach a compromise in the establishment of an accountability mechanism threaten to lead to a full-blown military escalation. In my contacts with you, especially with the permanent members of the Security Council, I've been reiterating my deep concerns about the risks of the current impasse and stressed the need to avoid the situation spiraling out of control. Mr. President, that is exactly the risk we face today, that things spiral out of control. It is our common duty to stop it. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. President. We are grateful to the Secretary General for his briefing. Your participation and your assessments and the authoritative word your authoritative word about the situation that has unfolded is of great significance. We concur with you. In the Middle East, there are many wounds. But presently, what is most important is the situation, the largest wound is the situation around Syria, insofar as the negative repercussions thereof are fraught with global repercussions. 2 days ago, the world received news. News flew around the world about a threat from the United States to conduct a strike against the Syrian Arab Republic. Warnings to prepare for this were also addressed to the Russian Federation. Let us recall that Syria, at the invitation of its legitimate government, has the presence of Russian troops deployed to combat international terrorism. We continue to observe dangerous military preparations to an illegal act of force against a sovereign state in what would constitute a breach of international law. Not only the use of force, but also the threat of force flies in the face of the United Nations Charter. And this is precisely what we have seen in recent rhetoric and action by Washington and its allies. Bellicose rhetoric is being ratcheted up at all levels, including at the highest levels, to Syria's shores. There are additional forces and means of the U.S. Navy and that of their allies is nearing. It appears that Washington has adopted a categorical policy to unleash a military scenario against Syria. This cannot be tolerated. Such a development of events is fraught with grave repercussions for global security, especially in the light of the deployment in Syria of the Russian military contingent. There are those who, with tacit consent, are observing the dangerous preparations. They state that they understand Washington's motivations, and they are engaging in direct incitement, thereby possibly becoming complicit in a possible military misadventure. At the Security Council, there are those who enjoy engaging in discussions about preventive diplomacy. For some reason, we neither hear them nor see them presently. And immediately, not only prior to the investigation, but even prior to establishment of the very fact that an incident occurred, guilty parties were identified. And apparently, they will have to be held accountable and punished. The developments, the unfavorable developments, is something for which there will have to be accountability, as was the case with the previous interventions, which plunged many countries into lengthy years of crisis, an abyss of crisis, and untold casualties. We have the evident recent experience of Iraq and Libya before us. This inter alia reflects the fact that American partners have adopted a largely consumerist approach to the Security Council. The Council needs both cover for Iraq test tubes or the Libyan no-fly zone. That is why they need the Council. Such a virtual empty test tube is what you are placing before us right now. The reckless conduct of the U.S. in an encroachment of the sovereignty of states and international law is unworthy of their status as a permanent member of the UN Security Council. It is unworthy for a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council. This status presupposes the highest degree of responsibility and not the right to saber rattle, which is absent in international law. Why are you seeking to plunge the Middle East into such difficulties, provoking one conflict after another, pitting one state against another? Who will benefit from a potential strike against Syrian troops who bear the main burden in combating terrorism? And they have achieved major victories in this regard. We understand fully well that the heads of Syrian armed groups have received instructions to begin an offensive following a potential act of force. Is the latest chaos, the latest wave of chaos, truly being unleashed only for the sake of that? The pretext is the alleged use of chemical substances in the Syrian city of Douma on 7 April. There is no credible confirmation of this. Our specialists found no traces of toxic substance use. The residents of Douma know about no such attack. All information about the alleged attack have been provided by the anti-government forces who have an interest in such a development of events. We have weighty justification to believe, and we have even information to believe, that what took place was a provocation with the participation of certain countries' intelligence services. We warned about this long ago. This is an echo of the Han Shehun scenario which took place last April. The Syrian government, which clearly needs all of this, is the last to need all of this, has announced that it has nothing to do with this, and it delivered a request for an urgent conduct of inspections at the area of the alleged incident by the OPCW forces. Jointly with the Russian troops, they provided security and safety guarantees. The mission is already undertaking work in Syria. We trust that it will be able to deliver on a genuinely independent and impartial investigation. The Security Council alone has the authority on the international stage to take decisions as to what measures can be taken against whom in the light of chemical weapons use in Syria. Russia continues to work robustly and fully to de-escalate the tensions that have recently arisen in international relations. We proposed a brief resolution of the Security Council be adopted in support for the inspection of the OPCW inspector mission in Douma. However, it was irresponsibly blocked by the US, the UK, and France. Thereby, these countries have demonstrated the fact that they have no interest in an investigation. The sole thing that they have an interest in is to oust the Syrian government and, more broadly, to deter and contain the Russian Federation. This has been clearly seen in other international and domestic political subjects, which are based on mystifications and conspiracy theories, at the heart of which each time you baselessly place the Russian Federation. What are you trying to achieve? Following the lengthy difficulties in clashes in Syria, large parts of that country have been stabilized. The political process is now afloat. Indicators of national reconciliation are coming to the fore. There has been a significant blow dealt to terrorists. We have never denied that you, too, made a certain contribution to achievement of this common objective. However, certain types of terrorists have always been sheltered by you to combat the regime and for you to advance your geopolitical priorities in the region. A British colleague constantly asks me, what is Russia doing to see to the implementation of Security Council Resolution 2401. I will respond. My country is almost the only party to be doing this. Over the course of the existence of the Astana process, more than 2,500 residential areas saw peace brought to them as a result of our efforts. This does not mean that they became victims, as you say it, of the regime, as you say it. With the assistance of Russia and other guarantors, they have established a normal relationship with the central authorities in Damascus. In Sochi, what was organized and successfully conducted with UN support was a Syrian National Dialogue Congress. How many cities, how many towns have you introduced peace to? How many groups have you persuaded to join ceasefire agreements? In order to break the deadlock in the situation in eastern Ghouta since the adoption of Resolution 2401, with the leaders of armed groups, with Russia's assistance, painstaking negotiations were held. The fighters and members of their family were able to, with full conditions of safety and security, to be evacuated from that area. Civilians finally gained an opportunity to cleanse themselves of many years of terrorism and rid themselves of such terrorism. And look at their unbounded joy. This footage exists, but for some reason your media outlets are not showing it. You had no concern for the fate of the hostages of fighters in eastern Ghouta, those from among supporters of the Syrian government. Fighters they're bargaining with the authorities for an exchange of hostages and said that they held 2,000 to 4,000 people. And now it is becoming clear that that number is far lower. People died due to harsh treatment and difficult labor with digging enormous tunnels for their torturers. You lament the fact that your bearded pilgrims were sent for free of charge tourist excursions into Syria. You lost an opportunity each time to cry about hundreds of thousands of people in the besieged eastern Ghouta. Now they need to be helped in restoring normal living conditions, but now you are no longer interested in this. And that is because now that territory is under government control. Now it will be necessary to engage in an inconvenient discussion for you on the blockade in Foix and Kafraya. When did the last humanitarian convoy reach the area? When did you even look into this? When was the last time you even looked into this? It will be necessary to respond for and be held accountable for Raqqa, which was destroyed by the coalition. Mr. President, there is a dangerous development of events which is fraught with far-reaching ramifications for global security. And the full responsibility in this case will fall to the United States and their allies. It is most unfortunate that old Europe continues to lose face. We call upon the leadership of these states immediately to reconsider, to return to the international legal fold, and not to bring the world to such a dangerous threshold. It is necessary to urgently seek a peaceful settlement through collective efforts. The Russian Federation stands ready to engage in equitable cooperation with all partners to resolve the problems which arise through dialogue. We steadfastly have focused on a peaceful settlement to the conflict in Syria on the well-known international legal basis, and we shall continue our proactive efforts to this end. We call upon all to follow suit, all of our partners to follow suit. Thank you.
I started to listen to my Russian friend and respond, but instead I'm in awe, Vasily, of how you say what you say with a straight face. I really, really am. Today's session of the Security Council has been called under truly strange circumstances. The Russian Federation has asked us to discuss what it calls unilateral threats related to Syria. What is strange is that Russia is ignoring the real threat to international peace and security that has brought us all here. And it is ignoring its own unilateral responsibility for all of it. What we should discuss today is the use of deadly chemical weapons to murder innocent Syrian civilians. That is one of the most blatant and grotesque violations of international law in the world today. It is a violation of all standards of morality. It violates the long-standing international consensus that chemical weapons represent a unique evil. Chlorine, mustard gas, and other chemical weapons killed 90,000 people and injured over 1 million in World War I. In the book, Canada in the Great World War, the Canadian soldier, A.T. Hunter, described it like this, quote, "The gas cloud gathered itself like a wave and ponderously lapped over into the trenches. Then passive curiosity turned to active torment, a burning sensation in the head, red-hot needles in the lungs, the throat seized by a strangler. Many fell and died on the spot, the others gasping, stumbling, with faces contorted, hands wildly gesticulating and uttering hoarse cries of pain, fled madly through the villages and farms and through the city itself, carrying panic to the remnants of the civilian population and filling the roads with fugitives of both sexes and all ages." End quote. Chemical weapons didn't produce the most casualties in World War I, but they were the most feared. In World War II, chemical weapons were employed on an industrial scale against civilians, resulting in the worst genocide in human history, which we recalled just yesterday on Holocaust Remembrance Day. That is what brings us here today. That is what chemical weapons are all about. That is why we must not stay silent in the face of horrible chemical weapons use in our own time. The first response to all this death and injury was the 1925 Geneva Protocol, which banned the use of chemical weapons in war. Later, in 1993, the Chemical Weapons Convention was signed. That convention obligates all of its parties to, quote, "never under any circumstances develop, produce, stockpile, transfer, or use chemical weapons." It also prohibits all parties from assisting anyone to engage in these activities. The United States is a party to this convention. Russia is a party to this convention. Every country that is a member of the United Nations Security Council is a party to this convention. Even the Assad regime has pledged to abide by the convention. So in theory, all of us agree on the core principle at stake today. No country can be allowed to use chemical weapons with impunity. Now that we have established what we all agree on, let's ask ourselves, what should we be condemning today? We should be discussing the actions that really brought us to this moment in time. We should not be condemning the country or group of countries that might actually have the courage to stand up in defense of our common principle, the principle against the use of chemical weapons. Instead, we should be condemning the country that unilaterally has stopped the Security Council from upholding this principle. Who is it on the Council that most exhibits unilateralism when it comes to chemical weapons? It is Russia alone that has stopped at nothing to defend the Syrian regime's multiple uses of chemical weapons. It is Russia alone that killed the Joint Investigative Mechanism, which allowed the world to ensure accountability for chemical weapons use in Syria. It is Russia alone that used its veto 6 times to prevent the condemnation of Assad's use of chemical weapons. It is Russia alone that used its veto 12 times to protect the Assad regime. And to make matters worse, it is Russia alone that had agreed to be the guarantor of the removal of all chemical weapons in Syria. If Russia had lived up to its commitment, there would be no chemical weapons in Syria, and we would not be here today. That is the Russian record of unilateralism. It is a record that has led to the trashing of all international standards against the use of chemical weapons. This meeting should not be about the so-called unilateral threats. It should be about the multiple actions Russia has taken to bring us to this point. Our president has not yet made a decision about possible actions in Syria. But should the United States and our allies decide to act in Syria, it will be in defense of a principle on which we all agree. It will be in defense of a bedrock international norm that benefits all nations. Let's be clear. Assad's most recent use of poison gas against the people of Douma was not his first, second, third, or even 49th use of chemical weapons. The United States estimates that Assad has used chemical weapons in the Syrian war at least 50 times. Public estimates are as high as 200. In the weeks after Assad's sarin gas attack last April that killed nearly 100 people, including many children, the regime used chlorine gas at least once and possibly as many as 3 times in the same area. Last November, just as the Joint Investigative Mechanism mandate expired, the regime attacked its people with sarin again in the Damascus suburbs. In January, Assad used at least 4 chlorine-filled rockets in Douma, and then he struck again last weekend. And thanks to Russia, there was no UN body to determine blame. But we know who did this. Our allies know who did this. Russia can complain all it wants about fake news, but no one is buying its lies and its cover-ups. Russia was supposed to guarantee that Assad wouldn't use chemical weapons, and Russia did the opposite. The world must not passively accept the use of chemical weapons after almost a century of their prohibition. Everything the United Nations stands for is being blatantly defied in Syria with the help of a permanent member of this council. All nations and all people will be harmed if we allow Assad to normalize the use of chemical weapons. It is those who act to violate the prohibition of chemical weapons who deserve our condemnation. Those who act to defend it deserve our support. The United States and our allies will continue to stand up for truth, accountability, justice, and an end to the use of chemical weapons. Thank you.
At the beginning, on behalf of my government, I would like to express our condolences to the people and government of Algeria for the tragic military plane crash that claimed the lives of 247 people. Second, I welcome the participation of the Secretary General in this very important session. I thank him for his comprehensive and accurate briefing that has clearly pointed that he and others in this council did understand the title of this session, and he spoke in the manner that is commensurate with the threats to international peace and security in light of the allegations and accusations against my country and its allies. The ambassador of Sweden said that the use of chemical weapons is a war crime. This is true. I agree with him. My government agrees to this. However, my dear colleague, don't you think that war in itself is a crime and needs to be stopped and to be prevented? Perhaps this would be a very good title in a book by the Peace Institute in Stockholm, the Institute of SIPRI. Maybe this would explain to the member states that war in itself is a crime. My colleague, the representative of the United States, said that the Syrian chemical weapons that killed the civilians were used 50 times. That's what she said. And 50 times chemical weapons were used, and it only killed 200 civilians. Imagine this. The Syrian government has reversed the course of the global terrorist war against my country by killing 200 civilians only, after having used chemical weapons 50 times. Isn't this talk of those who are amateurs? This is good for DC Comics, Superman comics. Is this how the White House strategizes? That a certain government uses chemical weapons 50 times to kill 200 civilians? How is this possible? How is this logical? And then my colleague, the United States of America, did overlook one important thing, that her own country, on board of the Kipri, has destroyed our stockpiles in the Mediterranean, along with ships by Denmark and Norway. Their own experts in the U.S. delegation should have told her that Ms. Sigrid Kaag said in this chamber in June 2014 that there are no chemical stockpiles in Syria. Could they have simply forgot all of this? Those who think that military force, Western massive military force in the Eastern Mediterranean, is because there is a Sufi Western affection towards those vile terrorists in Douma. Those vile terrorists were chased out of the north, as you are aware, and they are now on their way to Saudi Arabia, and then they will be recycled into mercenaries working in Yemen, and they will be used in other battlefields, including Yemen. No, massive military forces in the Mediterranean does not target those terrorists, a handful of terrorists. It targets the state of Syria and its allies. This should be the topic discussed today in this session. My colleague, the ambassador of the United States, was not horrified that her country used 20 million gallons of orange agent in Vietnam in 1961 that claimed the lives and the injury of 3 million Vietnamese, and 400,000 children are born with a deformity due to the use of the orange agent used at the time. And she was not horrified by the killing of her forces of thousands of Syrians in Raqqa and thousands of Iraqis in Al-Fallujah and Nusra using white phosphorus agents, which is a chemical weapon. Isn't this a war crime, my colleague, the ambassador of Sweden? I would like to read to you remarks of the former Defense Secretary of Britain, Henderson. And this is to my colleague from the British delegation. Mr. Henderson spoke of his country's and the United States' use of those chemical weapons in Iraq. He said, and I quote, "It is unbelievable that we would occupy a country, that's Iraq, to look for chemical weapons, and at the same time, we use chemical weapons against that very same country." End of quote. Mr. President, George Orwell The well-respected and ethical author in the West says, in a time of universal deceit, telling the truth is a revolutionary act. The truth that needs to be told today is that 3 permanent members of the Security Council are dragging the entire world once again towards the abyss of war and aggression. They seek to obstruct the work of the Council towards the maintenance of international peace and security, which is the main principle agreed on and adopted by our founding fathers when they adopted the UN Charter in San Francisco on the 26th of June 1945. And I would like to remind those and refresh their memory of paragraph 4 of Article 2 of the Charter, and I quote. And the ambassador of Bolivia read it, but I will read it once again. All members shall refrain in their international relations from the threat or use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any state or in any other manner inconsistent with the purposes of the UN. End of quote. The truth that needs to be told today is that these 3 countries have a legacy based on fallacies and fabricated narratives to launch wars, and this is to occupy states and control their resources and their fate and force a change of their governments. And the truth that needs to be told today is that the entire world, and this particular council, stand witnesses to the invasion, occupation, and destruction of Iraq based on a U.S. lie that took place in this very chamber 14 years ago. They are witnesses to France's exploiting this council to destroy Libya under the pretext of protecting civilians and ending the future of an entire people for a very simple reason. That is, their president at the time, Sarkozy, wanted a cover-up for his financial corruption, and this is an ongoing case, and you're all aware of it. However, some countries still fall for such lies that are promoted by these very same states to launch an aggression against my country, Syria. God bless the days when France, in this very same council, had their policies of Charles de Gaulle, and they refused the aggression of the US and the UK against Iraq. We lament those days. France does not now respect de Gaulle, and now it is one of the countries that launch aggressions against other countries. The truth that needs to be told today, Mr. President, is that the international community has not sought to rein in those who are reckless and undermine international relations and subjected to disasters since the establishment of this organization. Our biggest fear is if the international community does not come together to end the abuse of those who are reckless, this would effectively declare this organization dead in a very similar circumstance to that led to the ending or declaring the League of Nations dead. The truth that needs to be told today is that after the failure of the US, Britain, and France and their proxies in the region, in our region, after they failed to achieve their objectives in Syria through providing all forms of support to the armed terrorist groups, we see them today tweeting and bragging about nice, new, and smart rockets and missiles and defying international legitimacy through this council. And they are dispatching warplanes and fleets to achieve what their terrorist tools failed to achieve over the past 7 years. The truth that needs to be told today, Mr. President, is that the Syrian government did liberate hundreds of thousands of civilians in eastern Ghouta from the practices of the armed terrorist groups that used them as human shields and did hold them hostage over years and prevented any medical or food assistance from reaching them. It used their schools, homes, and hospitals as military bases to launch attacks against 8 million civilians in Damascus. The truth that needs to be told today is that some reckless people are pushing international relations towards the abyss based on a fake video prepared by the terrorist white helmets based on instructions by Western intelligence. The truth that needs to be told today, Mr. President, is that the international alliance, the so-called one, used its warplanes to serve ISIL to obstruct the victories of the Syrian Arab army and its allies against this terrorist organization. This international alliance made the White Helmets its media division that fabricates and falsifies in the benefit of this terrorist organization of Al-Qaeda. My government took the initiative to invite the OPCW to dispatch a fact-finding mission to visit my country and the alleged site of the incident. We provided all facilitation for the team to work in a transparent and accurate manner. They are supposed to start their work in a few hours. This invitation comes from our diplomatic experience and trust and power, and not because we are weak or afraid of any bullying or threats. The Syrian Arab Republic condemns in the strongest terms the three governments threatening to use power in a flagrant violation of Article 1 of the UN Charter that identifies the purposes of the UN towards the maintenance of international peace and security and the suppression of acts of aggression and other breaches of the peace. Mr. President, with the exception of the United States, Britain and France, we all understand that the Security Council is the body in charge with the maintenance of international peace and security and should stand against attempts to impose the law of the jungle and the rule of the powerful. But some member states think that the UN is just a business that works based on market rules and the supply and demand principle and exploiting the fate of peoples, or uses it as a podium for cheap shows and investing in more lies. This actually is a truth that disappoints peoples of the world. We're not reinventing the wheel here. The history of our relations with these countries is filled with agony, pain, and bitter experiences, and their very well-known aggressive and hawkish policies. What is another truth, and what is more important as a shocking truth, is that the silence of the majority vis-à-vis these aggressive policies is not collusion, but it is out of fear from their political blackmail and arrogance and economic pressure and their aggression, as they do not blink when they go after anyone who tells the truth. In conclusion, Mr. President, those three countries, the US, Britain, and France, if they think they can attack us and attack our sovereignty, at the time we would have no other choice except applying Article 51 of the Charter that gives us the right to defend ourselves, the legitimate right to defend ourselves. This is not a threat. This is a promise. This is a promise. We would not let anyone attack our sovereignty. Why do I say this is a promise? I say this because George Washington, the US leader, said some very important words 200 years ago, or even more than 200 years ago. He said, and I quote, "Gentlemen, shall I tell you about a sound that is higher than the sound of the cannons? It's the sound of the truth that emanates from the heart of a nation that wants to live free." End of quote. We in Syria also have leaders like George Washington and prominent personalities, and they are doing the same thing. They're protecting the unity and sovereignty of their own country. I thank you, Mr. President.